In May 1926, a man died in a rented villa in Italy. Under his pillow, they found prescriptions he couldn't afford to fill. He had already sold his metals. And when they came to bury him, the local shopkeepers placed a legal lien on his coffin over unpaid grocery bills. The man in that coffin was Mehmed VI, Vahiduddin, the 36th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Padishah, Caliph of Islam, custodian of the two holy mosques. The last man to sit on a throne his family had held continuously since 1299, 623 years, the longest unbroken run of any ruling house on earth at the time it ended. 3.5 years before those creditors seized his coffin, he had been the sovereign of an empire that spanned 3 continents, and he was one of the lucky ones. He at least got a funeral. 18 months after he fled Istanbul, the Turkish parliament passed a law, Law Number 431, that did something no other republic of the 20th century quite did. It didn't execute the royal family. It didn't imprison them. It did something colder and, in its way, more total. It deleted them. From the citizenship rolls, from the property registers, from the country itself. 156 people were stripped of their nationality and given days to leave. The law explicitly forbade them from so much as changing trains on Turkish soil, not living there, not visiting, passing through. The women were allowed back in 1952. The men had to wait until 1974, half a century. To understand how a family gets deleted, you need the shape of how the empire ran out of road, and I'm going to move fast through it, because the collapse is the setup, not the story. By the 1850s, the European chancelleries had a nickname for the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. That was a diagnosis and a business plan. If the patient was dying, the question was never whether to intervene. It was who got which organ. Over roughly 70 years, it hemorrhaged. Greece gone, Serbia gone, Romania gone, Bulgaria gone, Algeria taken by France, Egypt taken by Britain in all but name, Russia grinding away at the northern and Caucasus frontiers in war after war. The army that had taken Constantinople in 1453 and stood at the gates of Vienna twice was now being outbuilt and outshot by industrial states that could produce more steel in a month than the Ottomans could in a year. They tried to fix it. That's the part people skip. The Tanzimat reforms rewrote the legal code, restructured the army, built schools, laid telegraph lines. Abdülmecid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, and who is either the great villain or the great tragic figure of Turkish history, depending on who you ask, played the European powers against each other with real skill, pushed the Hejaz Railway toward Medina, and tried to convert the Caliphate from a dusty honorific into a live instrument of pan-Islamic influence. Hold that thought about the Caliphate, because it matters enormously later. But you cannot reform your way out of a debt spiral. By the 1880s, Ottoman finances were effectively administered by a European bondholders' commission. The empire was paying its creditors before it paid its soldiers. Then, in 1908, a movement of young officers and civil servants, the Committee of Union and Progress, forced Abdülhamid to restore the constitution he had suspended. A year later, they deposed him outright and installed his brother Mehmed V as a ceremonial figure. The Sultanate never recovered after that. The dynasty was already, functionally, a hostage of whoever controlled the army. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 stripped away nearly all the remaining European territory and drove hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees into Anatolia. Then in 1914, the Cup made the decision that finished everything. They entered the First World War alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. 4 years later, there was almost nothing left to govern. Gallipoli in 1915 was one of the few genuine Ottoman successes, and it produced the man who would end the dynasty, a young commander named Mustafa Kemal. Everywhere else was collapse. Mesopotamia, Palestine, the Arab revolt peeling the peninsula away. On the 30th of October 1918, the Armistice of Mudros handed over whatever military capacity remained. Mehmed VI had died that July. His younger brother, Vahideddin, Mehmed VI, inherited a throne with an occupying army in his capital. British, French, and Italian troops patrolled the streets of Istanbul. Allied warships sat in the Bosphorus with their guns trained on the palaces. And here, Vahideddin made the calculation that destroyed him. He decided the dynasty's best chance of survival was cooperation with the occupiers. He dissolved parliament. He endorsed the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which would have carved Anatolia itself into European and Greek and Armenian zones. He sent forces to fight the nationalists in Anatolia. You can build a sympathetic case for him. He believed resistance meant annihilation, and that a compliant sultan was better than no Turkey at all. But from Ankara, it looked like exactly one thing. The sovereign of the Turks was collaborating with the men carving up Turkey. By 1922, Mustafa Kemal had driven the Greek army out of Anatolia and forced the Allies back to the negotiating table. He had won, and he had no intention of handing the country he had just saved back to the man who had signed it away. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Sultanate. The vote was not unanimous in spirit. Deputies hesitated. You don't casually vote to end a 600-year institution. Kemal ended the hesitation with a speech that survives as one of the great pieces of political intimidation in modern history. Sovereignty, he said, is not given. It is taken. If the assembly accepted this, wonderful. If not, it would happen anyway, and some heads might be separated from some bodies along the way. One deputy voted against, Zia Hurshid of Lazistan. 4 years later, he was hanged for plotting to assassinate Kemal. The Sultanate was over, and Vahideddin was now a private citizen in a city where the new government was openly discussing trying him for treason. Here's a detail I love, because it is so undignified and so human. The last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire did not leave in a carriage. He left in a British military ambulance. Before dawn on the 17th of November 1922, in the rain, Vahideddin and his 10-year-old son, Prince Mehmed Ertuğrul, were driven down to the waterfront in ambulances with British guards. General Charles Harrington, Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in Istanbul, personally escorted them aboard HMS Malaya, a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship. The palace staff weren't told their ruler had gone until hours afterward. As the Malaya pulled out, he looked back at a city his family had held for 469 years. He said his greatest sorrow was leaving his homeland. He never saw it again. Neither did his son. He went first to Malta, arriving on the 9th of December. Then a brief and politically catastrophic stop in the Hejaz, where he performed the pilgrimage and hoped to find a base. The British shut that down immediately. Under no circumstances was the deposed Caliph of Islam going to be permitted to settle anywhere in the Muslim world, because London ruled tens of millions of Muslims in India and Egypt and had no interest in handing them a living symbol to gather around. So he ended up in San Remo, on the Italian Riviera, in a rented villa. King Victor Emmanuel III extended a formal welcome. Mussolini, newly in power, sent his compliments to the majestic Ottoman Emperor. There's a story that circulates that the Italian king offered him palaces and a pension, and that he refused, on the grounds that an Islamic sovereign cannot accept charity from a non-Muslim monarch. I'd treat that one carefully. It's the kind of story that grows in the retelling. What is documented, and what is far sadder, is where the money actually went. He had left Istanbul with about £20,000 sterling, a serious sum in 1922. It did not last, and the reasons are almost farcical. A significant portion was gambled away in casinos, and worse by his former brother-in-law and chief aide, a man called Zeki Bey, who was later discovered to be on Ankara's payroll, reporting on the exiled sultan's every movement. Another large share went to con men. Because here's the thing about a deposed monarch in a resort town. He attracts a very particular kind of visitor. Restorationists with a plan. Fixers who know a general who knows a tribe. Men with schemes who needed only a little seed capital. And Vahideddin, who still believed the Turkish people would call him back once things settled, kept paying. He felt obliged. That's the phrasing in the sources. He felt obliged to be generous because in his own head he was still a sultan, and sultans are generous. The Turkish government opened a consulate in Genoa for the specific purpose of watching him and planted informants in his household. And he was frightened. In his final years, he carried a revolver in his pocket because he genuinely believed one of the well-wishers filing through his sitting room might be there to kill him. He began his memoirs. He never finished them. When the Caliphate was abolished in March 1924 and his entire family was thrown out of the country, something in him gave up. He stopped trying to reclaim the throne. On the 16th of May 1926, his heart gave out. And then came the coffin. He owed roughly 60,000 lire to the tradesmen of San Remo. His daughter Sabiha Sultan had to scrape money together, and King Faisal of Iraq eventually helped settle the debts. It took until the 3rd of July before he could be put in the ground, and when he finally was, it was at the Süleymaniye Tekke in Damascus, in a mosque complex funded by Suleiman the Magnificent. Buried, in the end, in a building paid for by his own ancestor, in a foreign city that would take him because his own would not. There was street fighting in Damascus that day. His son Selim recorded that when the family passed through Beirut, a huge crowd came out, and ordinary Beirutis kissed his hand and called him Sultan. He was the first Ottoman sovereign since 1453 who could not be buried in the city Mehmed the Conqueror had taken. When Kemal abolished the Sultanate, he did something that looks strange until you see it as a two-stage demolition. He kept the Caliphate. He split the offices. The Sultanate, political sovereignty, was gone. The Caliphate, the spiritual leadership of Sunni Islam, was preserved as a purely symbolic post, and the assembly appointed a cousin of the departed Sultan, Abdülmecid Effendi, Abdülmecid II. This was cleverer than it looks. It diffused the religious objection at home, kept the Indian Muslim lobby quiet at a delicate diplomatic moment, and bought 18 months to consolidate the republic. Then you can remove the empty shell without anyone rioting. Abdülmecid himself is one of the most quietly interesting figures in this whole story, and he gets flattened in most tellings into the last caliph, a nice man who painted. He was a serious painter, not a hobbyist. His work was exhibited in Vienna, and if you look at his canvases today, they're startlingly modern. There's a famous one of women reading Goethe in a palace interior that could hang in any European gallery of the period without apology. He played piano well. He read and spoke French, German, and English on top of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. He supported the Red Crescent, and he was a patron of the Armenian Women's Association in the immediate aftermath of a period when being Armenian in Anatolia had been a death sentence. For 16 months, he did the job. Weekly Friday processions to the mosque, crowds turning out to see the Caliph of Islam. Except the crowds were thinning fast. There's an account of one of his last Friday outings in early 1924, where observers noted there were more American tourists along the route than actual worshippers. The office had become a photo opportunity. He knew. He wrote to the government asking for an increase in his allowance, a modest request from a man whose predecessors had owned the treasury. Kemal's reply was built to humiliate. The Caliphate, he said in substance, was a historical relic with no justification for existing. Its holder was maintained purely as a courtesy, and it was impertinent of him to be writing to government officials at all. That letter is the eviction notice. Everything after it is paperwork. On the 3rd of March 1924, the Grand National Assembly sat for a session that was, given what it did, remarkably short. Law number 431, Read the actual text, and it's almost bureaucratic. It abolished the caliphate with a curious piece of legal reasoning, arguing that the caliphate was inherent in the republic and the assembly, and that maintaining it separately was therefore redundant. Not "this is wrong," just "this is surplus." Then the operative clauses. Every member of the House of Osman, every prince, every princess, every consort, every child was expelled from Turkish territory. Their citizenship was annulled. Their property was to be liquidated within 1 year or seized by the treasury. And the law made clear this was permanent. They were forbidden to return and forbidden even to transit through the country. 156 people were named. There's a persistent story, and it is a rumor, so I'll flag it as one, that Ataturk himself would have exiled only the princes, the male line with a theoretical claim, and that it was İsmet İnönü, then Prime Minister, who insisted the entire family go. Whether that's true or self-serving hindsight, it is what Ottoman family members themselves believed for decades, and it tells you how they processed it. They wanted to believe the great man hadn't meant to do this to the children. Because here is who was on that list. 3-year-old girls, old women who had spent their entire lives inside palace walls, consorts of dead sultans, princesses who had never handled money, not who were bad with money, who had never handled it, because the concept of buying something yourself did not exist inside their lives. Men trained from boyhood in imperial protocol, calligraphy, cavalry command, and Ottoman court poetry, which is a curriculum with precisely zero market value in 1920s Europe. And when you add the people who went voluntarily, the spouses and children not technically covered by the law who weren't going to be separated, plus household staff who flatly refused to abandon families they had served for 30 years. The real number who walked out of Turkey in that first week runs into the hundreds. Abdülmecid, the deposed caliph, didn't even get the notice the law technically allowed. He was given hours. Before dawn on the 4th of March, he and his immediate household were put in cars and driven 50 kilometers west out to Satalka and put on the Orient Express there. Not at Sirkeci station in Istanbul, where anyone might see, but at a small station out toward the Bulgarian border. The government did not want photographs of the Caliph of Islam being deported from the capital. His private secretary, Salih Keramet Nigar, recorded what happened at that station, and it is the single most quoted moment of this entire episode for a reason. Nobody would come forward. There had been a coordinated smear campaign in the Turkish press over the preceding weeks, specifically to soften public opinion for the expulsion, and being seen paying respects to the caliph was now a career-ending act, possibly worse. So people stood back. Except the station master, who stepped forward and formally, publicly saw the last caliph of Islam off with full courtesy. He was Jewish. The rest of the family left from Sirkeci on the 6th of March. Prince Ali Vasib, great-grandson of Sultan Murad V, and the only Ottoman prince who ever wrote his memoirs, which is why we know so much of this at all, noted how few friends came to the platform. Same reason: fear. And now the detail that turned a hardship into a catastrophe. Most of them did not pack properly. They took a case each, some jewelry, family photographs, a few documents. They left furniture, libraries, paintings, correspondence, wardrobes, everything. Because they were certain, not hopeful, certain, that this was a political spasm and they would be home by autumn. The Turkish people would not stand for it. It would blow over. Each family was handed 1,000 Turkish lira on the way out. Enough for tickets and roughly a month of living. The exile lasted 28 years for the women and 50 for the men. I want to spend a minute on something that sounds like an administrative footnote and was actually the mechanism that broke them. The Turkish Republic did issue them travel documents, reasonable enough on the face of it. You can't deport people into a legal vacuum. Those documents were valid for 1 year, and they were no longer Turkish citizens, so there was no authority on earth that could renew them. By sometime in 1925, most of the Ottoman dynasty was stateless. Think about what that means in practice. In Europe, in the 1920s, you cannot legally cross a border. You cannot take a job in most countries because you can't get a work permit. You cannot sign certain leases or open certain accounts. If you're in Nice and there's work in Marseille, you can't take it. If a relative is dying in Beirut, you can't go. You are pinned to whatever ground you happened to be standing on when the clock ran out, permanently, with no appeal and no embassy anywhere in the world that considers you its problem. Prince Ali Vassib went to the French government and, after a great deal of effort, secured courtesy passports for family members. It let them move again. It was a genuine act of rescue, and it's the reason a number of them survived. But France never granted them citizenship. Not then, not later. And someone in the family did the historical arithmetic, because you would. In 1525, Francis I of France was captured at Pavia and held by Charles V, and it was Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman intervention, and Ottoman diplomatic pressure, the beginning of the Franco-Ottoman alliance, that helped get the French king out and gave France a lifeline against Habsburg encirclement. 400 years later, France would not give Suleiman's descendants a passport. They noticed. The first phase of the collapse was selling. Jewelry went first, and it went badly. These were people who had never bought anything in their lives and had no reference point for what a stone was worth. They were selling in a buyer's market to dealers who could read the desperation from across the room in cities where everyone knew exactly who they were and exactly why they were selling. Pieces that had been in the family for generations went for a fraction of value. Some went for the price of a few months' rent, then the properties. Remember, Law 431 gave them a year to liquidate their private assets in Turkey. That required a trustee on the ground because they were not allowed into the country to sell their own houses. The trustee sold the properties, then he kept the proceeds. I want to be precise about how bad that is. That money was not extra. That money was the entire plan. It was what they had told themselves would carry them until the political situation reversed. When it didn't arrive, the family went from temporarily embarrassed to genuinely destitute, and there was no recourse. They could not sue in the courts of a country where they had no standing, as non-citizens legally barred from entering. What follows is documented, and it is grim. Members of the Ottoman imperial family worked as dishwashers in European hotel kitchens. Women who had grown up with attendants dressing them scrubbed floors for a wage. There are accounts of family members begging in the street and of family members going through refuse for food. Some died of hunger. That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's in the record. The aid situation is its own tragedy. Muslim rulers did try. Osman Ali Khan, Asaf Jah VII, the Nizam of Hyderabad, at the time plausibly the richest private individual alive, sent money. Prince Omar Tosin of Egypt sent money. Sharif Hussein, king of the Hejaz, sent money. Most of it never reached the people who needed it, for a reason that's almost stupid in its simplicity. Nobody knew where anyone was. The family had scattered across France, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Switzerland, Hungary, and eventually the United States. There was no register, no central address, no organization. Aid went to whoever the donors happened to have heard of. The ones in the worst shape were, by definition, the least visible, and some refused it flatly. These were people whose entire self-conception was built on being the ones who gave charity, the founders of endowments, the patrons of hospitals, and a number of them could not psychologically make the switch to receiving it, even when the alternative was hunger. Here is the detail I find hardest to shake, and I want to state it plainly because it deserves to be better known. Some of the exiled Ottoman families survived on assistance from Ottoman Armenians who had themselves fled to Europe. I'm not going to varnish that or use it to make a point about reconciliation, because the history it sits inside is far too heavy for a neat moral. I'll just leave it there. It happened. Meanwhile, Ankara was watching. This was not exile and forget. The Turkish government tracked the family's movements abroad, reacted with suspicion when members married foreigners, and applied diplomatic pressure. When some exiles began publishing anti-Ankara material out of Greece, the Turkish government leaned on Athens until it stopped. And Europe in the 1920s and 30s had frankly other things on its mind. A continent digging out of one world war, sliding into depression, watching fascism rise, was not going to organize on behalf of a deposed Muslim dynasty. Newspapers ran the occasional feature. There was a real appetite for the spectacle of a princess scrubbing a hotel floor. Sympathy sold copies. It didn't pay rent. I want to stop the narrative here and deal with the strongest objection to this entire story, because when I've talked about this before, the sharpest pushback is this. The Caliphate wasn't a Turkish institution. It was an Islamic one. And outside Turkey, there was essentially no real support for keeping it under Ottoman control anyway, so the tragedy is being overstated. That's a serious argument, and it deserves a serious answer, because it is half right in a way that's more interesting than either yes or no. Start with the emotional reality, which was never in doubt. In British India, the Khilafat movement was one of the largest mass mobilizations in the subcontinent's history. Founded in 1919 by figures including the Ali brothers, Abul Kalam Azad, and Mukhtar Ahmad Ansari, it organized boycotts, mass protests, and delegations, and it did so in explicit alliance with Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. Millions of Indian Muslims spent years agitating to protect an office held by a man in Istanbul most of them would never see. And they were broadly sympathetic to Mustafa Kemal. When the Sultanate was separated from the Caliphate in 1922, the Khilafat leadership did not revolt. The first All-India Khilafat Conference in Delhi in December 1922 formally accepted Abdülmecid as the new caliph. Then came March 1924, and the movement essentially detonated. Its entire reason for existing had been removed by the very people it had been defending. Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar's reaction was bitter and public. The movement fractured over what to do next, and it never recovered. In Egypt, the reaction was shock. Al-Azhar's scholars condemned it. Politicians across the Egyptian spectrum criticized it. Muhammad Hussein Haikal of the Liberal Constitutional Party argued that the Turks had been impulsive and immoderate, and that Egypt's slower approach to modernization had done a better job of balancing reform against religion. So, enormous emotional investment, genuinely global. That half of the objection is wrong. Now the half that's right. Emotion is not a mechanism. And the moment the Ottoman claim was gone, the Muslim world discovered it had no agreed procedure for producing a caliph and no consensus that it wanted one badly enough to fight over it. Watch what happened next. King Fuad of Egypt wanted it and worked for it. Sharif Hussein of the Hejaz claimed it and was widely rejected precisely because he was seen as a British client, which was fatal for a position whose entire claim rested on independent Islamic leadership. Within 2 years, he had lost the Hejaz itself to Ibn Saud. In May 1926, they actually convened a conference in Cairo to settle the question. Candidates floated included Fuad, Hussein, Sultan Yusuf of Morocco, Abd al-Krim of the Rif, and the Aga Khan. The Indian Khilafat Committee, the largest and best organized pro-caliphate body on earth, did not attend. They had by then drifted toward the Saudis, who had just taken the Hejaz. The conference concluded that a caliphate was not currently possible. Read that again. The definitive gathering assembled to restore the institution voted, in effect, not right now. Partly because of genuine theological disagreement about whether it was even necessary. Mostly because almost every candidate was living under or dependent on a European empire, and everyone in that room could see that a caliph who answered to London or Paris was worse than no caliph at all. So the honest synthesis is this. The abolition was experienced as a catastrophe by tens of millions of Muslims who had no say in it, decided by a parliament in Ankara representing a fraction of them, on grounds of Turkish domestic politics. And also, at the same time, the institution had been hollow for a long while. Most of the Muslim world had been under European rule for generations by 1924. And once the Ottoman claim collapsed, there was no realistic mechanism and insufficient collective will to reconstitute it anywhere else, which is why the vacuum never got filled, and why, a century later, the idea keeps being reached for by people with no legitimate claim to it. The ISIS declaration of 2014 being the ugliest example, precisely because the office's last real holder was removed by a vote rather than replaced by a successor. There's no ending to the story. There's just a stop. I'd genuinely like to hear where you land on that, because it's the part of this history where reasonable people disagree hardest. Now let me tell you about specific people, because the aggregate hides the individual, and the individuals here are extraordinary. Shehzade Mehmed Abdülkarim was born in Yıldız Palace in June 1906 during his grandfather's reign. His grandfather was Abdülhamid II. His father was Mehmed Selim, Abdülhamid's eldest son. After the expulsion, the family went to Lebanon and then Damascus, and Abdülkarim did what a lot of exiled princes did. He ran out of money, and he started listening to people with plans. In 1932, he left Damascus for what became one of the most improbable journeys any Ottoman ever took. He went east, India, then Singapore. And in May 1933, the Japanese press reported his arrival in Tokyo. The Japanese had a use for him. Imperial Japan was building buffer states along the Soviet and Chinese frontiers. They had already installed Puyi, the last Qing emperor, as their puppet in Manchukuo. In Xinjiang, East Turkestan, there was a Turkic Muslim population in open revolt against Chinese authority, and Tokyo calculated that an actual Ottoman prince, a grandson of Abdülhamid II, carried a prestige no local warlord could match. The proposal on the table, in some accounts, was that he would take a throne as ruler of East Turkestan and Caliph. He toured Japan. He visited Tatar communities and made substantial donations to Tatar associations. The Japanese papers covered him heavily, which was the problem because that coverage was read in Nanjing, in Moscow, and in Ankara. And here is a sentence I did not expect to write about a story that began in Dolmabahce Palace. The Republic of Turkey and the Soviet Union ran a joint counter-operation through their embassies against an Ottoman prince in Tokyo. By September 1933, the plan was exposed, and he had to leave Japan. He went to Shanghai, then attempted the thing directly, traveling to East Turkestan himself to organize the local population. He raised a small force. Chinese government troops destroyed it almost immediately. He fled to India. His Japanese sponsors dropped him. He applied for asylum in the United States and boarded a ship, reportedly listing himself as a student, though American customs officials weren't convinced and noted he appeared to be traveling for an undisclosed purpose. He arrived in New York with essentially nothing. By the accounts of people who knew him there, he was broke and increasingly desperate and had pinned some hope on a wealthy married woman who ultimately refused him. On the 3rd of August 1935, at 29 years old, Shehzade Mehmed Abdülkarim was found dead in his New York hotel room. The police recorded it as suicide. The New York Times ran it. That is the official record, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But his family disputed it then, and Turkish sources dispute it now. His cousin Orhan Effendi, who said he had been staying in the same room, raised questions about the circumstances that were never resolved. Given who had been trying to stop him, Japanese handlers he had failed, Chinese intelligence, Soviet and Turkish services running joint operations against him. The suspicion is at least comprehensible. There have been campaigns in Turkey in recent years to have his remains repatriated. He was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Maspeth, Queens, an Ottoman prince, grandson of a sultan, in a cemetery in Queens. And here's the part almost nobody knows. He left two small boys behind in Damascus, born in 1930 and 1932. Their names were Dündar Ali Osman and Harun Osman. Hold on to those, because they come back at the end of this in a way you will not see coming. Shehzadeh Ertuğrul Osman was born in Istanbul in 1912, another grandson of Abdülmecid II. At 10, he was sent to Vienna to study. He was still there in 1924 when the news reached him that his family had been expelled and he could not go home. He never went back to live. He stayed in Vienna for years, then moved to the United States in 1933, settling around New York. And what he did with the next several decades is, to me, the most quietly extraordinary life in this entire family. He worked. He took a job as a consultant for a Canadian firm called Wells Overseas in mining, which sent him regularly to South America. He lived in a two-bedroom, third-floor walk-up above a restaurant on Lexington Avenue in the 70s, the only residential unit in an otherwise commercial building. He lived in that apartment for around 64 years. It was rent-controlled. In the early 1990s, he was paying about $390 a month for it. He kept dogs, a lot of dogs. He was, in the technical sense, the man who would have been Grand Sultan Osman V, Emperor of the Ottomans, Caliph of Islam. And by every account of everyone who met him, he thought this was funny. That's what gets me. He didn't curdle. People who interviewed him describe a man who handled the largest reversal of fortune available to a human being with dry understatement and no self-pity whatsoever. The passport situation is my favorite piece of it. For most of his life, he simply didn't carry one. He maintained he was an Ottoman citizen, an entity that had not existed since before the Second World War, and traveled instead on a certificate drawn up by his attorney, which countries accepted. He only started carrying a real passport after 9/11, when American border procedures tightened and the improvisation finally stopped working. In 1992, the Turkish government invited him to visit. He came. He walked through Dolmabahce Palace, where he had played as a small boy 70 years earlier, reportedly on a public tour as an ordinary visitor. Asked afterward what he made of modern Turkey, his verdict was 4 words: democracy works well here. He became the 43rd head of the House of Osman in 1994. In 2004, the Republic of Turkey granted him citizenship, 80 years after it had taken his families away. He died in Istanbul in 2009 at 97 of kidney failure, the last head of the house who had been born on Ottoman soil. Nesliha Sultan was born on the 4th of February 1921, and her birth was announced by cannon fire in the 4 corners of the Ottoman Empire. Commemorative coins were struck. Her name was written into the official palace register of dynasty members. She was the last person ever entered in that register. She was also a genealogical anomaly. Her mother's father was Mehmed VI, the last sultan. Her father's father was Abdülmecid II, the last caliph. Both of them. She was 3 when the family was expelled. She grew up in Nice, in the same financial difficulty as everyone else. And then in 1940, she married Prince Abdel Monem of Egypt, son of the last Khedive, and stepped straight into another royal family. In 1952, the Egyptian free officers overthrew King Farouk, and in the arrangement that followed, Abdel Monem was appointed regent for the infant king Fuad II. From September 1952, he was sole regent, which made Nesliha, an exiled and stateless Ottoman princess, the de facto First Lady of Egypt, for 10 months. On the 18th of June 1953, the Revolutionary Command Council abolished the Egyptian monarchy outright. 29 years after being expelled from one country for being royalty, she watched it happen again in another. Then it got worse. In 1957, she and her husband were arrested by Nasser's government on charges connected to treason. She got out of prison because the President of the Republic of Turkey intervened and demanded her release. Sit with the shape of that. The Turkish state, which had stripped her of citizenship as a 3-year-old and banned her from the country for 28 years, was the power that got her out of an Egyptian jail cell. She eventually came home to Istanbul, the city she had been carried out of as a toddler, and died there on the 2nd of April 2012, aged 91. The last surviving member of the dynasty born while the dynasty still ruled. Her biography, written by the journalist and historian Murat Bardakçı from her own testimony and family documents, is the single best source on this whole exile, and it exists in English. Shehzade Osman Fuad was a grandson of Sultan Mehmed V and an actual soldier. He commanded Ottoman forces in the North African campaign during the First World War, operating with the Senussi against the Italians in Libya. He was also, at one point, president of Fenerbahce, one of Turkey's biggest football clubs. After 1924, he settled in Nice, and in 1954, he became the 39th head of the House of Osman. He died in Nice in 1973 and was buried in a Paris cemetery. The men of the dynasty were permitted to return to Turkey in 1974. He missed it by 1 year, 50 years of waiting, and he missed it by 1 year. Shehzade Mehmed Orhan, born in a palace in Üsküdar in 1909, spent his exile in France and worked for a period as an advisor to King Zog of Albania. He became the 42nd head of the house in 1983, died in Nice in 1994, and is buried in Nice, not Istanbul. Shehzade Mehmed Seyfeddin, a son of Sultan Abdülmecid and an accomplished composer who had studied under Callisto Guatelli, died in Nice in 1927, 3 years into exile. Ali Vasib, the memoirist who saved the family with those French passports, went from Hungary to the south of France to Egypt, and finally got home in 1974 after half a century. He became head of the house in 1977 and died in Alexandria in 1983. He is buried in Nice. Bayezid Osman, the 44th head of the house, was born in Paris in June 1924, 3 months after the expulsion, to parents who had just lost everything, and died in New York in 2017, aged 92. Notice the pattern in those burial places. Nice, Paris, Damascus, Medina, Queens. An entire dynasty's worth of graves scattered across 4 continents, and almost none of them in the imperial tombs of Istanbul, where every one of their ancestors lies. Abdülmecid II, the last caliph, went from that train at Çatalca to Switzerland briefly, then to Nice, which became the informal capital of the exiled dynasty. His finances improved through the one asset an exiled royal family still had to trade: a marriage. His daughter, Durushevar, married the son of the Nizam of Hyderabad, the same Nizam who was among the richest men alive. That connection became a lifeline, and moving the money from India to a former caliph in France required British authorization, which tells you exactly how closely London was watching. He settled into a strange, dignified, hollow routine. He painted. He played piano in the afternoons. He attended Friday prayers at the Grand Mosque of Paris. He wrote memoirs that eventually ran to 12 volumes. People who met him described someone who existed in 2 worlds at once: a European aristocrat and an Istanbul gentleman, always in the fez. In 1939, with war coming, he moved from Nice to Paris. His health was going. On the 23rd of August, 1944, he died of a heart attack in his villa on the Boulevard Suchet. The date is not a coincidence, and it's one of the eeriest details in this story. That was the liberation of Paris. There was fighting in the streets outside. By multiple accounts, stray rounds came into the villa, and the shock brought on the attack that killed him. The last Caliph of Islam died in the middle of the liberation of Paris. His family asked Turkey for permission to bury him in Istanbul. Turkey refused. His body stayed in the mortuary of the Grand Mosque of Paris for close to a decade while the question went nowhere. He was eventually buried in the Baqi Cemetery in Medina, the city where the Caliphate had been invented 13 centuries earlier. There's a symmetry there that's almost too neat. The last holder of the office laid to rest in the city of the first. But it also means the man who was born in Dolmabahce, who grew up on the Bosphorus, who painted its light his entire life, never got back to it. Not alive, not dead. In 1952, 28 years in, Turkey allowed the women of the dynasty to return. Why the women first is not fully documented, and I would distrust anyone who tells you with total confidence. The plausible reading is that under Ottoman succession law, the dynasty passed strictly through the male line, so the princesses were never a claim to the throne, only a symbol. Symbols are safer. It also came under a new government, in a republic that had survived a world war and its founder's death, and was by then secure enough to be generous about it. The women who came back were old. Most had spent their entire adult lives somewhere else. They returned to a country rebuilt from the ground, up around the idea that their family had been the problem. The palaces were museums and ministries. The alphabet had changed. They had left a country that wrote in Arabic script and came back to one that wrote in Latin letters. The empire they had been born into was on the school syllabus as a cautionary tale about decline. The men waited another 22 years. It was 1974 before male members of the dynasty were permitted to return. A full half-century. By then, most of the original exiles were dead. The men who came back were largely sons and grandsons, men born in Nice and Beirut and Cairo and Paris, who had built entire lives elsewhere, and who in many cases spoke French or Arabic more comfortably than Turkish. A lot of them came, a lot didn't, and the ones who didn't had a reasonable case. Come back to what? The properties were gone, the status was gone. The Republic had spent 50 years defining itself in opposition to your family. Going home meant becoming an ordinary citizen in a country that had deliberately erased your name from its own story. The family had, along the way, taken the surname Osmanoğlu, son of Osman, after Osman I, the frontier chieftain who started the whole thing in 1299 with a few hundred men in northwestern Anatolia. Whenever this story comes up, someone says, "At least it was better than the Romanovs." That's true. Obviously true. In July 1918, the Bolsheviks took Nicholas II, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, their hemophiliac son, the family doctor, and 3 servants into a basement in Yekaterinburg and shot them. There is no comparison to be made with a bullet. But I want to argue that better than being shot is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and that if you line the 20th century's fallen dynasties up side by side, the Ottoman case is genuinely unusual. Not the worst, the most complete. Look at the others. The Habsburgs lost an empire in 1918, and Austria did pass laws stripping titles and property. Karl I was exiled and died young in Madeira. But the family stayed a European family, embedded in a Catholic aristocratic network with relatives on half the continent's thrones. Otto von Habsburg went on to sit in the European Parliament for 2 decades and died in 2011 as a respected elder statesman. Distinguished exile is a completely different experience from statelessness. The Hohenzollerns. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and went to the Netherlands and lived out 22 years at Huisdoorn, a country house he owned, with a large staff, receiving guests, writing memoirs, and continuing to be a nuisance until 1941. He lost his throne. He never lost his class. The Qing Puyi was deposed in 1912, but kept the Forbidden City and an enormous stipend for over a decade under the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Then a warlord evicted him. The Japanese picked him up and made him Emperor of Manchukuo. The Soviets captured him. China put him through years of political re-education, and he was released to work as a gardener and an archivist, and to die in Beijing in 1967. Brutal, humiliating, and also, he stayed in China. He was reintegrated, on the state's terms, into the country he had ruled. China's relationship with its imperial past is complicated, but it was never a matter of the man himself being forbidden to exist on Chinese soil. The Romanovs were murdered. And here's what people forget. The surviving branches, the ones who got out, were received as royalty across Europe, married into other houses, and were supported by relatives, including the British royal family, for generations. Now the Ottomans. They weren't killed. They were unmade. Citizenship annulled by statute. Property confiscated by statute. Presence on the territory criminalized by statute, including transit. Travel documents that expired into statelessness. And no aristocratic network to catch them, because Muslim dynastic marriage did not interlock with Christian Europe's. The Ottomans had never been part of the cousinhood that connected Windsor to Romanov to Hohenzollern. When they fell, there was no European family to take them in, and the great Islamic powers that might have were themselves under British or French control and needed London's permission just to send them a check. And crucially, nobody made them martyrs. Executed royals get shrines, canonization, restoration movements, DNA tests, films. The Ottomans got a bureaucratic deletion and a 50-year silence, which is a far more effective way to end a dynasty than killing it. There is nothing to avenge. There's just an absence. That's the argument. Not worse than the Romanovs. Different in kind, and as a method for making a 600-year-old institution vanish from a national imagination, considerably more effective. For most of the 20th century, the Turkish Republic treated the Ottoman period as an embarrassment to be managed. A backward theocratic monarchy that had lost an empire and deserved to. Ottoman history was minimized in schools. Ottoman buildings decayed. The dynasty was taught as corrupt, decadent, and incompetent. That is flipped and hard. Muhteşem Yüzyıl, Magnificent Century, the drama about Suleiman and Hürrem, became a phenomenon not only in Turkey but across the Middle East, the Balkans, and beyond, in dozens of countries. Piyetat. Abdülhamid ran for years on state television, recasting the Sultan the Young Turks deposed as a besieged defender of the Muslim world. Ottoman aesthetics are everywhere in Turkish public life. Politically, an explicit embrace of the Ottoman past as a source of pride rather than shame has been a defining feature of the last 2 decades, which puts the Osmanoğlu family in a genuinely strange position. They came back as ordinary citizens to a country that had deleted them. Now they're invited to cultural events. They appear on television. Their weddings are covered in the press. Some are active on social media. They work in business, academia, media, the arts. They live in Turkey, Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. Several dozen people carrying the surname. And they have precisely 0 political power, no claim to anything, and no throne to claim it to. A family with an extraordinary name and an ordinary life, which is a very odd thing to be. In 2006, members of the family gathered at Dolmabahce Palace for the presentation of a documentary about the exile, produced by Turkish state broadcaster TRT. For a number of them, it was the first time they had ever been inside the building. Think about what that room felt like. Walking through marble corridors your grandmother described to you from memory in a rented flat in Nice. Seeing the chandeliers and the light off the Bosphorus that you had only ever heard about. Knowing your family was marched out of this building at dawn and told never to come back. Now, the part I promised you. Remember the 2 small boys left behind in Damascus when Shehzada Mehmed Abdülkarim died in that New York hotel room in 1935. Dündar Ali Osman, born 1930. Harun Osman, born 1932. Orphaned young. Raised in Damascus in a family that had lost everything twice over, once by expulsion and once by their father's death. Dündar Ali Osman became the 45th head of the House of Osman in 2017. Harun had returned to Istanbul in 1974 with the first group of men allowed home. Dündar never made it back. He lived his entire life in Damascus. In his final years, the Syrian civil war and the collapse of relations between Ankara and Damascus made it impossible to bring an elderly, fragile man across the border, despite efforts to arrange it. He died in Damascus on the 18th of January 2021, aged 90. Head of the House of Osman, died in the country of his exile. Never once set foot in the land his family ruled for 600 years. When he died, the president of Turkey telephoned his younger brother Harun to offer condolences. And according to the account of that call, part of the conversation was about a television show, Caliph Abdülmecid. Harun Osmanoğlu mentioned that he watched it, which, of course, he did. It's a drama about his own great-grandfather, produced by the state that expelled his family, broadcast to millions of people who now regard that family as a source of national pride. Harun Osman Osmanoğlu is 94 years old. He is the 46th head of the House of Osman. He lives in Istanbul. He has 9 grandchildren. In 2024, a great-grandson was born and named Mehmed Selimhan. 100 years after Law 431, the head of the Ottoman dynasty is an old man in Istanbul watching a TV show about his ancestor. Somebody left a comment on the last version of this story that I've been thinking about since. Empires rise and fall. That's a fact of life. And it's true. It is the most reliable pattern in human history. Every empire mentioned in this video is gone. The British Empire is gone. Austria-Hungary is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. Nothing holds. But I don't think that's what this story is actually about. Empires falling is normal. What happened to the House of Osman is something narrower and stranger. The deliberate, legal, procedural removal of a family from a country's present and from its memory. Not a war, not a massacre. A bill passed in an afternoon that took 156 people, including 3-year-olds, and made them in the eyes of the law from nowhere. The empire's fall was inevitable. It had been coming for a century, and it was arguably deserved. The exile was a choice. Somebody drafted it, somebody voted for it, and somebody enforced it against children. And the reason it's worth telling isn't the palaces or the titles. It's the specific texture of what happens to human beings when everything that defined them is removed at once. A woman who had never handled money washing dishes for a wage. A prince with no marketable skill in the 20th century, pawning his mother's jewelry below value. A man who should have been called Emperor of the Ottomans getting the joke in a rent-controlled walk-up on Lexington Avenue and telling it well. A sultan's coffin held against a grocery bill. That's not a lesson about empires. That's a lesson about how thin the ground is under all of us. The House of Osman was founded in 1299 by a frontier chieftain nobody had heard of. It's still here. A few dozen people, scattered, ordinary, carrying a name that used to make European kings nervous. They lost the empire, the throne, the caliphate, the money, the houses, the graves, the passports, and for 50 years, the right to stand on their own soil. They kept the name. That was all. And it turned out to be enough to survive on. So tell me what you think. Was Law 431 a necessary act of state building or cruelty dressed up as policy? Should Turkey have compensated the family, and does a 100-year-old confiscation still create an obligation today? And on the caliphate, was it a real institution worth mourning? Or had it been a formality for so long that 1924 only made the paperwork match reality? I read every comment on these. The argument in the comments last time was better than most of what I found in print.